Well, good morning, everybody. It is so good to see all of you. My name is Jamie. I am one of the pastors here, and I'm so glad that you are here. How exciting that we are able to be here in person and celebrate Easter. Last year, Easter, if you remember, well, you won't remember this part, but I was at home eating Easter brunch with my wife while we watched the service online because last year churches were not allowed to be physically open. Of course, you can never close the church, but the building was closed. And so we were all streaming Easter last year. Just kind of crazy times. I think it was the first Easter that I was not in church since I was a kid, probably. And just a really kind of crazy time. And this whole year has been kind of crazy. And I know I've had an opportunity to meet a handful of folks who have started coming to Believers over the last year. And we did a membership class not that long ago, and there were some people who had started watching us online and have eventually made their way to campus and are now members of Believers Church. But maybe some of you've started coming recently, and what we used to do pre-pandemic thing is we would occasionally have a lunch for newcomers, and it was just an opportunity for me to be able to meet some folks who are coming into Believers. And so I think it's been 15 months or so since we've done anything like that, but we are ready to give it a whirl on April 18th. I would love to invite you to have lunch with me and with my wife Bonnie and a few of our key staff members. And really, there's no agenda to this luncheon at all except for to be able to say hi and have a conversation with you, learn a little bit more about your story. We intentionally keep this gathering small, and we did that even pre-pandemic, so it's not just about safety. It's about we don't want to have so many people in there that we can't have a conversation. So space is limited, but you are invited. And if you would say that you're kind of new around here, you can go to the events tab in the Believers Church app, and you can register for the free luncheon. It's for you. It's for your family, so I hope you will join me for that. This year, of course, we're all here, but we also still have a bunch of people who are eating Easter brunch while streaming the services, so shout out to all of you online. So glad that you could be here too. And I don't know about you, but streaming content from home over the last year, I probably have streamed more than my fair share of content. Have you? And like the amount of options for streaming is just kind of crazy. So whether it's Netflix or Disney Plus or Discovery Plus, or there's like a dozen that have cropped up over the last year. But yeah, we've kind of gotten to the place where we're streaming just tons of content, and people are regularly looking for the next thing that they can kind of binge watch. So I was just going to share a couple of the things that we've watched over the last year that we thought were kind of fun. So The Good Place, kind of a funny take on heaven and the afterlife. The first two seasons really funny, kind of cute. The last two seasons really bizarre and weird. I'm not sure that I would necessarily recommend those, but the first two seasons were pretty good. The next one kind of surprised me because I'm not like a fan of the royal family or anything. The only thing that really, I know this is the royal family is partly here, but the only thing that I find astonishing about the royal family is that an entire nation props that up. I don't get that. But The Crown, that was incredible. Really, really enjoyed that. That was really fun. And then the next thing, it's not really one because there's just so many of them. And I love kind of all of them. I've kind of gotten, it's kind of my fixation. And it's the true crime docuseries kind of stuff. Man, I can't get enough of those. Where they they'll investigate like a real crime that actually happened, and they'll kind of walk through what happened, and then they'll show how they investigate it, and they'll interview, show some of the interviews that took place to try to determine, and then they'll see, like they'll solve it, sometimes correctly, oftentimes incorrectly, and I just find all of that really fascinating. So like The Staircase. Really good one. Making a Murderer, that was been out for a little while. The Pharmacist, also really good. I can't get enough of those. And having watched so many of them over the last 6, 12 months or so, and I'm not trying to brag or anything, but I feel like I could probably be a private investigator, like a detective. I'm pretty sure I could. Because I kind of have hunches now, don't you? And it turns out I'm not alone. There's like a whole cottage industry of internet sleuths. Did you know that was a thing? I didn't know it was a thing until I started watching docu-series on crimes. But it's a thing, and it's a bunch of hobbyists who think that they too could be private detectives. And they use the internet to try to collect as much data as they can on different crimes, and they'll even inundate police departments with leads and tips and all the stuff. So it turns out that everyone's a detective these days, and it got me to thinking about the whole Easter story. And if Easter were to happen like in modern times, and I wonder what would be written about it. And if it became like a Netflix true crime docuseries, like I wonder if we would watch it and say, like that's pretty incredible. Or if we would say it like literally, that is incredible, as in not at all believable. So what I want to do is I want to invite all of you, because I know a bunch of you, I can tell by how you responded, a bunch of you have watched a bunch of these docudramas also. And so I want to invite you detectives to join me to kind of look at this Easter story. And what I want to do is I want to just kind of break it down and look at the various clues that kind of make up this story, and just kind of see where this takes us. So first things first, we got to look at the crime, or the punchline of the Easter story. And the crime, I guess, for Easter, it is the disappearance of the body of Jesus. And I say disappearance, the followers of Jesus, they would claim that the body of Jesus didn't disappear, but that he was resurrected, that he was dead, but then he didn't stay dead, he came back to life, which is a pretty bold claim, right? And if you're going to claim that someone was dead and then they came back, you better have an awful lot of evidence that would back that up. Because, I mean, we're pretty rational, some of us. I don't know, maybe I'm overestimating our capacity, but we're not just willing to believe anything. And so if you're going to make a claim like that, you better have some strong evidence to kind of back it up. And I'll just kind of level with you. After reading on this topic for quite a bit and just kind of exploring it, and because I am an amateur professional detective, I've kind of arrived at this conclusion that the case for Easter is actually kind of terrible. So stick with me, and you'll see where I'm going with this whole thing, why I think it's so weak. And if you're taking notes, and I hope that you will, in the Believers Church app, there's a place for you to kind of follow along, and you can view it as kind of like your detective's journal. Here's the first reason that I think the case for Easter is so terrible, and it's the lack of empirical evidence. And I'll give you just a definition for what that means. Empirical evidence is the evidence based on experiences and direct observation through research. Now, it's a little hard for us to go back and look at Jesus, because, I mean, that was a long time ago. So we can't really go back then, but we can empirically look at other people. I mean, so annually, 150,000 people. 150,000 people die every single day globally. That's a lot of people. And we can empirically look at how many of them come back to life. And I've been to more than my fair share of funerals. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that not one of them bounced back. Of course, today more and more people are getting cremated. It makes it harder, but I've never seen it. So here's the big idea for today. And if you're taking notes, you can jot it down. The reason that I've never seen that, the reason none of that's ever happened, is because dead people don't rise. I mean, dead people don't rise. That's what doesn't happen. I've seen a bunch of shows and read from a bunch of people who talk about near-death experiences, and they will, see the light at the end of the tunnel. They'll get a glimpse of heaven or even a glimpse of hell, or they'll have some kind of experience that kind of changes their perspective, and then they write about it. But the key word to that is near-death experience, not a I was dead and then I'm not dead experience. So that's a different thing altogether. Followers of Jesus claim that Jesus actually died. Now, I will tell you, there's not everyone believes that, because you have to figure out, like, if dead people don't rise, then you have to conclude that Jesus, maybe he wasn't dead. The idea that Jesus never died is actually in the Quran. I don't know if you knew that or not. But Ahmadiyya Muslims, they believe that Jesus, he didn't die. He actually fled to India. And there is a shrine in Srinagar, Kashmir today that marks the supposed burial site of Jesus. It's kind of interesting. Some believe that when Joseph came and asked Pilate for the body of Jesus so that they could bury him, some believe that Jesus wasn't actually dead, that he was just in a coma. And then when they laid him into a cool tomb, the coolness of that environment and whatever resuscitated him. And so there's this resuscitation theory as opposed to a resurrection theory. In fact, Pilate, who ordered the crucifixion of Jesus and who would have been an expert kind of in the whole crucifixion process, when Joseph came and asked for the body of Jesus, he was even a little skeptical that Jesus was dead. In fact, we read this in Mark's gospel account. And Mark, he was not a companion of Jesus, the author of that particular gospel, but most scholars believe that Mark's gospel was actually Peter's account of the life of Jesus, dictated to Mark, and then Mark wrote it down. And we read this in that gospel, that Pilate couldn't believe that Jesus was already dead, because normally it was a much more prolonged experience than what the amount of time that Jesus was there on the cross. So he called for the Roman officer and asked if he had died yet. And the officer confirmed that Jesus was dead. So Pilate told Joseph that he could have the body. Now, I know it says that a Roman officer confirmed that Jesus was dead, but can we get honest? Like today, you can't just grab, anybody and say, hey, is this person dead? You need like a doctor. You need a medical examiner to authenticate whether someone actually died or not. Now, I just mentioned Peter. He's one of the supposed eyewitnesses to the whole resurrection thing. And that brings me to another reason that the case for Easter is so terrible, and it's this. The star witness is a documented liar. That's true. You've seen this in crime dramas, right? prosecutors, they find a jailhouse snitch, and they bring him into the courtyard, into the courtroom because the supposed killer or whatever confesses something in jail, and so they bring him out. And anytime I see a jailhouse snitch in one of the documentaries, don't you get just a little, your guard is up a little bit, because you're like, how credible is this person? I mean, after all, they are a jailhouse snitch. They're in jail for their own crime. And so, like, you kind of have to look at what they're going to say with a little bit of skepticism. And so that's kind of Peter. So let's look at him. He's one of the early leaders of this Jesus movement, and not long after the supposed resurrection of Jesus, he proclaims to a rather large crowd in Jerusalem, and he says, God raised Jesus from the dead, and we are all witnesses. So there he is. He's a witness. And now Jesus is exalted in the place of highest honor in heaven at God's right hand. And in any crime docuseries, you have to examine, the credibility of the witness. So let's go back and look at Peter prior to the crucifixion, because that's where we'll see kind of the character of Peter. So the night that Jesus is arrested, Peter, who's one of Jesus's closest companions, he bolts. He takes off because he's scared that he's going to get in trouble too. So he leaves. And then he can't stay away, though, because it's, his friend. He's kind of curious as to what's going to happen to him. So he comes back to find out what's happening to Jesus. And we read this as Jesus is before the high priest being examined. We read that the guards lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat around it. And Peter, he joined him there. And a servant girl noticed him in the firelight and began staring at him. And finally, she said, this man was one of Jesus' followers. But Peter denied it. Woman, he said, I don't even know him. Strike one. After a while, someone else looked at him and said, you must be one of them. No, man, I'm not, Peter retorted. I mean, that's 2 strikes. About an hour later, someone else insisted, this must be one of them because he's a Galilean too. But Peter said, man, I don't know what you're beeping talking about. He did. There was another gospel account that included the beep. Can we all agree that's 3 strikes? And Peter's out as a credible witness. Peter's one of the closest associates of Jesus, and he's not dependable. He's not believable as a witness. Speaking of people close to Jesus, let's look at his brother James. You may not like your brother, but you certainly know your brother. You may have shared a bedroom. You certainly shared time around the dinner table. You have all the same family stories, all that kind of stuff. So James knew Jesus. And when Jesus kind of launches into the I'm the Son of God and the Messiah thing that he was doing, James doesn't believe him. So you could say this, you could say those who knew Jesus best don't believe in him. I mean, think about that. Those who do believe, like Peter, not very credible. Those who don't believe, like the brother of Jesus, they actually seem really credible. So what do we know about James during the life of Jesus? Well, we know that Jesus was getting kind of famous. There was a lot of rumors starting to circulate that maybe Jesus was the Messiah. And there was an important Jewish festival that was getting ready to take place in Judea, and his brothers, the brothers of Jesus, they start kind of, basically they're picking on him. And here's what we read in John's gospel. It says, Jesus' brothers said to him, leave here and go to Judea, where your followers can see your miracles. You can't become famous if you hide like this. If you can do such wonderful things, go show yourself to the world. And then John adds a really important detail, and it's worth noting. Even his brothers didn't believe in him. I mean, those closest to Jesus, those who knew him the best, they didn't believe. And if that's not the nail in the coffin, then this next detail is, and I'll give you the detail, and then we'll fill in the information. The heading under this one, though, is inadmissible evidence. Inadmissible evidence. Okay, if you've watched any of the crime dramas and documentaries, you know that not all evidence is even allowed to be presented in a court of law. And that wasn't just true, or that's not just true of our current justice system. That was true in antiquity as well. Not all evidence is weighed the same. In fact, not all evidence is even allowed. So I'll set the scene for you. Jesus has died, and as dead people do, he stayed dead. Yeah, he stayed dead. He was in the tomb. And some of the women who were followers of Jesus, they went to the tomb, and they went there with some spices to anoint the dead body of Jesus. And it was basically their version of embalming. And, you know, when you take embalming fluids to a tomb, it's because you would believe that the person that you're going to see is dead. Because, as our big idea of the day is, dead people don't rise. So they get there, and here's what we read. It says, Saturday evening, when the Sabbath ended, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, they went and purchased burial spices so they could anoint Jesus' body. And very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise, they went to the tomb. And on the way, they were asking each other, who's going to roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? But as they arrive, they look up and they see that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled aside. And when they entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe sitting on the right side. And the women were shocked. But the angel said, don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body. And this next phrase is the one that you need to pay really close attention to. So then this angel says, now go and tell his disciples, including that liar, Peter. I added that liar part. That Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you before he died. And to all of that, I would simply say, objection. Inadmissible evidence. You say, well, I mean, what are you objecting to? I am objecting to the fact that a woman was presenting testimony about a risen Jesus. Now, I've done some homework on this, and it's true, there's nothing in the Bible that excludes a woman from testifying in a court of law. However, in Judaism, there was an oral tradition, an oral law, and it was recorded in what's called the Mishnah, which records the oral law and tradition of Jewish rabbis. And I'm going to read to you an excerpt from one of these. It says, these are considered unfit witnesses, gamblers with dice, those that lend interest, pigeon racers, can't trust a pigeon racer. You can't today, you couldn't then. Telling you. Pigeon racers, those who trade in the produce of the sabbatical year, and slaves. This, the general principle. All evidence that a woman is not eligible to give, these people mentioned above also are not eligible to bring. So bare minimum, the testimony of some women would have been viewed with great skepticism. And in Greek and Roman law, there were also restrictions placed on women when it came to presenting in a court. So the fact that a couple of women are the first ones to bear the message of a resurrected Jesus, it makes it less believable. So I'll just kind of conclude by saying, if I were to watch a Netflix docuseries on the story of Easter, I would conclude that it was a terrible case.
It's true. In ancient times, the testimony of a woman carried little, if any, weight. In fact, Judith S. Antonelli writes, "The exclusion of women from courts was normative. Courts were made by men for men. Egyptian, Babylonian, and Canaanite women did not go to court, nor did Greek women, even in later times." Throughout Scripture, we read examples of the cultural reality of the inequality between men and women. However, it's also true that God's view is that women are equal with men. And that was made uncomfortably clear to the watching world through Jesus' ministry. See, Jesus' view and inclusion of women was completely countercultural. So before we make our final conclusion on this case, I want to spend a little more time digging into this part of the story. John's gospel tells us that Mary told him and Peter that they've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him. So the three of them ran back to the tomb, and there they found it, just as Mary had said, empty. So let's pause here for a second. Who is this woman, Mary? Well, we don't know a whole lot about her life. We don't know a whole lot about her story, but we do know that Mary Magdalene is mentioned 14 times throughout the gospel accounts. She was from a town called Magdala, which was known for its wealth, for its jewelry, for its fabrics. I kind of like to imagine it was sort of like the fashion mecca of the world then. So like New York City, maybe Paris. That's probably what Magdala was like. She was an independent woman, and we know that because of her name. She wasn't named after her father or her husband, as would have been the custom. She was named after the place of her work, of where she was from, and she was probably pretty independent. Luke introduces us to Mary as one of the many women who supported Jesus' work. So soon afterwards, Jesus began a tour of nearby towns and villages, preaching and announcing the good news about the kingdom of God. He took with him his 12 disciples, along with some women who he had cured of evil spirits and diseases. Among them were Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. Joanna, she was the wife of Chuza, Herod's business manager, and Susanna, and many others who were contributing from their own resources to support Jesus and his disciples. So here we see that Jesus knew Mary. He had cast out 7 demons from her. She wasn't just an occasional face in the crowd. No, she was a follower. She was a disciple. Scholars believe that she was one of the primary financial supporters of Jesus' ministry, and she was considered a leader. And we know that in part because in the Gospels, when she's listed, she's often listed first when she's with a group of people. So with that as kind of our foundation for who she is, let's get back to the case. John 20:10 says that then the disciples returned to the place they were staying. See, throughout the events of the crucifixion, the men who had been Jesus' crew, his boys, his disciples, his followers, well, they all ran. They scattered. They hid. But not Mary. Mary stayed. Mary watched as they lowered her beloved, broken Jesus' body from the cross. She was there. She was ready to tend to his body. And now, 2 days later, with the tomb empty, the guys leave again because, as John tells us, they did not yet understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. The disciples returned to the place where they were staying. And again, Mary stayed. She didn't leave. And because she stayed, she sees the evidence. John 20:11 says, Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stooped. She looked in. You can imagine yourself in this scene, right? With everything you just experienced just 2 days prior, you were probably feeling all of the feelings. You're going through denial, shock, probably a deep sadness, and now anger, as it is very likely by what you see that someone has come and stolen the body of your friend, your Jesus. What is going on? Well, she turned to leave, and she saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. Dear woman, why are you crying? Jesus asked her. What are you looking for? She thought he was the gardener. Sir, she said, if you have taken him away, just tell me where you've put him, and I will go and get him. Mary, Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, Rabboni, which means teacher in Hebrew. Don't cling to me, Jesus said, for I haven't yet ascended to the Father. But go, find my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. No, don't miss this, guys. Jesus could have appeared to the guys first. He appeared to Mary, and he told her to go and tell. Mary Magdalene is the first proclaimer of the gospel, of the good news. She is the announcer that Jesus is alive. Oh, friends, I get it. The facts of this case are terrible. Nothing makes sense about it. And yet, here we sit, over 2,000 years later. The facts are laid out before us, and the only thing that makes sense of this case is this: God did the unbelievable. Scripture isn't propping up a fanciful story, putting people on pedestals to make a great case for a mighty king. It does just the opposite. It tells a real story of incredibly ordinary people who make the biggest mistakes, who lead outrageously messy lives, and yet fulfill prophecy and testify to the greatest events in history. Peter, who denied Jesus and cowered in fear, he later boldly proclaims the message of Christ. James, who thinks his brother is completely insane, just a short while later, he leads the church in Jerusalem that bears his brother's name. And it doesn't stop there. He dies a martyr's death because he believed his brother was, in fact, the Son of God. And Mary, the least credible witness, and not because of her character, mind you, just because she was a woman, was among the first to see the empty tomb. She was the first to see and talk to the resurrected Jesus. And she was entrusted to tell the disciples that he is alive and would be ascending to heaven. How is any of this possible? It is because Jesus did the impossible. He predicted his death, his burial, his resurrection, and what's more, he pulled it off. And because of that, the Jesus movement didn't end with the resurrection. In fact, the terrible case for Easter is still being made today, and you and I are a part of that story. So where do you fit into this case log? See, God can rewrite your story, but he is never changing his. His plan to restore broken people through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross and then use them to show others his glory continues. Your messiness does not disqualify you from your effectiveness. Just like he used a bunch of broken people to change the world then, he is doing the same thing today.